Right, today we find ourselves in Chapter 3, Section 2, sort of a review parts in what we've talked about before, dealing with the railroads and how the railroads changed, because we're going to include this transcontinental railroad and the construction that happened right after the Civil War ended. And these railroads that are going to continue when we talked about in the last chapter, moving towards the west, but now more about the capital investments and the government land grants that came from this period, which lead to potential profits and obviously some corruption that we talked about in this period of time called the Gilded Age. So during the Gilded Age, the United States experienced an industrial revolution. It's another aspect of it. You could see on this map where you see what things are being discovered. We talked about oil already in Titusville. We'll go through that again. You have the gold in San Francisco, the cotton fields still in the south, and the silver fields and coal mines that are going to lead to the industrialization. So we're talking today about railroads specifically, and I think this number puts it in perspective. After at the immediate end of the Civil War, 1865, you have about 35,000 miles of railroad lines. In 1900s, you're going to have 200,000 miles. Well, why is this happening? Well, to figure out why this is happening, we first have to go back to the Civil War. And something we don't really talk about a lot, but the Civil War stimulated mass production techniques that were used after the war to make industrial goods. In this case, you're talking about cannonballs. They're made on an industrial scale so that we could survive and do the things that we need to do. Now we're going to try to take this war-type tactic of mass production, and we're going to put it into an industrialization process. Why? Well, because industrial goods like iron and steel and railroads are going to be needed to rebuild the nation after the war and build America's new cities. Now, I know it sounds like we're being repetitious, but again, this book is working in themes. So even though we've talked about Reconstruction for the last two chapters, it's still that whole process of why did we have to change the way our economy worked, and it was to help to rebuild the South and to change the way things are happening. So America's Industrial Revolution began as a wave of inventions. The wireless transmitter and the telephone, which we talked about in the last section, it revolutionized the way we communicate. The Bessemer process created a cheap way to transform iron into strong, lighter steel, and new inventions allowed for improved industrialization. All these processes and those inventions in the last chapter are going to be useful in how we are building or creating the infrastructure across our country. So if you look at it from the perspective of the railroad was going to be America's first big business, and when I'm saying big business, I'm saying they're huge. Railroad construction grew in the years before the Civil War, but the tracks were owned by companies that were different, and they were not standardized. So that's the problem we had. We had to come up with a solution for how we were going to create a standardized system to spread from both sides of the country. Now remember, we talked about in the last chapter, this was the whole West that we discovered and we utilized in creating the Bonanza farms up here in the north, where you can see there's great railroad tracks taking these Bonanza farms of the wheats back to the east. You also have these Texas Prado farms, which were taking the meat back to the south. And then of course out here in California, where we try to get the gold and all the riches and wealth and obviously the people out there. So that's why we're talking about this. So there was a need for something called the Transcontinental Railroad. In 1865, the United States had about those 35,000 miles, and then all of a sudden we're going to have a boom. And the reason why is we're going to create something called the Transcontinental Railroad. In 1862, there is something called the Pacific Railway Act, and this act gave two corporations, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, permission to build a transcontinental railroad, and it offered each company land along the right-of-way, which meant it gave them basically a free passage or free grants in order to build this, as long as they would work together to create the product. The first one's going to be the Union Pacific, and it's going to be under the direction of General Engineer Grenville Dodge, who was a former Union general. The Union Pacific Railway began to push westward from Omaha, Nebraska. The railway workers on the Union Pacific included Civil War veterans, newly recruited Irish immigrants, frustrated miners, farmers, cooks, and ex-convicts. At the height of the project, there's about 10,000 workers who are working on that Union Pacific line. The other company is going to be called the Central Pacific, and this is going to begin as the dream of engineer Theodore Judah. He sold stock in his flooding Central Pacific Railroad Company to four Sacramento merchants. These four people became eventually huge fortunes and huge success. But the thing is, most of his workers came from China. We talked about that immigration on the coast up here when you're looking at California, Angel Island, when we talked about like later on when you're talking about legal immigration. But most of these people from the eastern United States to California is where they were looking at working in that process. So it's going to be pretty quick. And it's a lot of work, but workers are going to complete the Transcontinental Railroad in only 4 years, despite the physical challenges. Each mile of track required 400 rails, and each rail took about 10 spikes. The Central Pacific started in the west and laid about 688 miles of track, and the Union Pacific laid about 1,000 miles. On May 10th of 1869, hundreds of spectators gathered at Promontory Summit in Utah, and they watched the dignitaries hammer five gold and silver spikes into the final rails. That's going to join the Union and Pacific Central. And the engineer Greenville Dodge was at this ceremony. This is going to be where they connected together the final spikes that are going to join for the end or the creation of this, which we're going to talk about again as the Transcontinental Railroad. So the two companies come together, they meet, and this is where you find now from here on out we're able to create branches up and down, north and south, east and west, but we all have it standardized now. So we're going to be able to build into and creep into these areas where we have settlers traveling. We talked about the coal mines, the boom towns, lots of different places. So America is then going to start an industrial revolution, which is going to be fueled by four major industries. And the way I think about it is the ROSE system. It's the railroads, the oil, the steel, and electricity. And that's how we're going to create a modern industrial city or modern industrialized country to create work in that way. So during the Gilded Age, railroad construction boomed was led by many tycoons like Cornelius Vanderbilt, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But large companies bought out small railroads and standardized gauges and schedules and pulled cars. And you can see this from the fact of look how many miles he has or he's building every single year to go through and create. And again, this is going to be that period of time where, and we'll talk about in the next section, about how these giant tycoons are going to come in and build and create control all aspects of the production, which means that not all people are going to have the same chance to get rich as those who already have the money in that spot. So a good simulation to show you the railroad expansion that led to a boom in the economy. And this is, again, once the lines are created from this whole concept, you have all these artery railroads that are going to go all up north, south, east, west, and they're going to stimulate it because of the demand for coal, oil, iron, and steel to try to get them to all aspects of our country and create the industrialized nation that we know today. In this time, we also create time zones. So the map here shows you the good thing to show you where you have the central, eastern, and standard. We're, of course, in the eastern time zone. But before there were time zones, each community sent its own clock. So the question I would say is, why did the growth of railroads require standardized time zones? So that's something to think about. Like, why is there such a need now that we create this system to change it? So the steel that we're going to create and these infrastructures that we're going to create are going to lead to the creation of skyscrapers, longer bridges, stronger railroads, and heavy machinery. So we're actually building the actual infrastructure of our modern world. But with all this going on, there's going to be a lot of government corruptions and a concept called robber barons. So with this great wealth, railroad entrepreneurs required in the 1800s led to accusations that they had built their fortunes by swindling investors and taxpayers, bribing officials, and cheating on their contracts and debts. Perhaps the most notorious corrupt railroad owner was Jay Gould, who practiced insider trading. He manipulated the stock prices. Bribery often occurred frequently because government was so deeply entangled in the funding of the railroads that railroad investors discovered that they can make more money by selling for free government land grants than by operating the railroads themselves. So some of these people bribed political representatives to vote for more grants, and this is going to be where you're going to start to see, which we'll talk about more in depth in the next section, this creation of where does the average worker who works very, very hard this period of time have a chance to survive, or is the big businesses so corrupt and so in control of our government that we won't be able to come through. So when the industrial capitalists of the Gilded Age become known as the robber barons or the captains of industry, we're going to discuss in the next section whether or not this is something that's a positive or a negative based off of the perspective that we're going to talk about in each scenario.